In this video, we will review the computation formative on adding and subtracting rational numbers, and you will need to look at this video if you plan to do a retake. So we have our first number, I guess, expression or equation we're trying to evaluate. We have -5 plus 4 and 1/4. So in one of the previous videos, I went over how we can turn this -5 into a number with including a fraction to make it easier to do this computation, right? So I'm going to just go ahead and use a traditional algorithm to solve this. I'm going to turn -5 into -4 and 4/4. So now my -5 is -4 and 4/4. The important thing to note here is that the 4 is negative as well as the 4/4. Both of these are negative to get the -5. So if I were to use the decomposition strategy later on, which we will talk about, I have to recognize both of these as negative numbers. So I have -4 and 4/4, and I am going to change my addition problem into a subtraction problem. And I am going to keep the sign of the number with the largest absolute value. In this situation, my -5 has the largest absolute value. So I know that it will be negative. Well, I'm just go like that, even though that's not correct. I know that I should first start with my smaller, but I know right away that I'm just dealing with fractions here. So 4/4 minus 1/4 is 3/4. So I have a -3/4 here as my answer. Okay. Here I have -8, and I am subtracting 7/10 from that. If I again look at this as adding a negative number versus subtracting a positive number, I can see that I am just going to be going increasingly in the negative direction. So I can just add these two numbers together. And I know that I'm going negative, so my sign has to be negative. All right. Here I have 4 and 5/10 plus -1/2. So again, I have to recognize this 4 and 5/10 as equivalent to 1/2, or rather 5/10 as equivalent to 1/2. That's important for me to know. So I am going to set up again my subtraction problem, because adding a negative is the same as subtracting a positive. And because I know these are equivalent, 5/10 minus 1/2 would give me 0. I can just bring down my 4, right? And of course, this is a positive number because this has the largest absolute value. So at any time this doesn't make sense, you can send me an email, you can send a remind, or you can simply slow down, practice the problem again for yourself, and see if it makes sense. All right, so here, which number has the largest absolute value? 5. So I know, again, it's going to be a positive sum. I also know that, like I did here, I can rewrite my 5 as 4 and 4/4. This problem is almost identical, but kind of not. Okay, so I have 4 and 4/4. Now I'm going to subtract 1/4 from that. Now, why do you need to do this? You do not need to do this. This is simply a strategy that you can use if it helps you. Some of you can say, okay, I see already that I'm going to have 3/4 if I take 1/4 away from a whole, and that's fine. But if you don't see that, use this to help you. Okay, so now I'm just going to, again, I subtracted the 1/4 from 4/4, and I'm going to bring down my 4. And because I know 5 is the positive, right, and it has the largest absolute value, my answer has to be positive. All right, so the last two. All right, if I look at this, right, let's think. Am I going increasingly negative or am I going positive? Well, you say, okay, you have a negative 1/2, and you're taking another negative or another 2 steps in the negative direction. So how does that make sense? Well, again, if I rewrite this as a addition problem, and only if you need to do this will that help. Instead of subtracting a positive, I am adding a negative. So that shows me that I'm going increasingly in that negative direction. And now I can just say, oh, I have 2, and I add another 1/2 to it. So I have 2 and 1/2. Negative 2 and 1/2. And this is where that number line might help for people who are still trying to visualize this, because I'm at negative 2, and I go from 0 to negative 2, and then I go another, oh, I'm sorry, I go from, let me change this so it better models the problem. I have 0, there's my 1, here's my negative 2. All right, I have my half here, my negative half, and I want to go 2 more steps. 1 step, and then 2 whole steps in the negative direction. So that will leave me at negative 2 and 1/2. So I really like this problem, and it stumped us. And I can see why. The reason why I think it might have stumped us is because we forgot, or perhaps didn't know, the importance of 0 pairs. Okay, so 0 pairs are the numbers that cancel each other out. We already know additive inverse, or the additive inverse of a number, are the 2 numbers that add up to 0, right? So in this situation, in this expression, there are 2, there's a 0 pair, or there are numbers that if I add them together, I would get 0. So I know if I look at this, well, negative 5 and 2/10 minus 3 and 1/10, that would not give me 0, right? Because I'm going increasingly negative. But negative 5 and 2/10 plus 5 and 2/10 would give me 0. So I could use the commutative property, meaning I could change the order in which this problem is written, if that helps. I could even use the associative property at this time, meaning I can regroup the way this problem is written. Okay. And now I can clearly see that, oh, these 2 are going to cancel each other out. It is going to be a 0 pair. And so I have 0 minus 3 and 1/10. So this minus now becomes a negative 3 and 1/10. Okay, so again, the importance of being flexible with understanding the minus sign as either subtracting or a negative. All right, so you need to watch this video in order to do the retake of this formative, and I will see you in class.